Hello and welcome back, and today I want to continue talking about PS5 upgrades in terms of SSD, but today's video is very focused on the subject of heat sinks. Now, a number of you who are looking at upgrading the internal storage on your PS5 aren't really aware of what heat sinks are. Are they important? Do you really need them? They seem like a real weird add-on. That why do the brands not just include it themselves? There seem to be so many reasons when it comes to upgrading your storage on your PS5 now that it is available in the software beta, that a number of you have kind of gone, wait, what is a heatsink? So today I'm going to talk through what heatsinks are, why they are important, what you should buy, what you need to avoid, like the clappers, and also some recommendations at the end. But I know a number of you are probably watching this video and all you want is to know the right SSDs. Well, you don't have to watch the rest of the video. Go to the link in the description. There's an article there over on NAS Compares where I've detailed 4 or 5 SSDs that I would recommend. Some for double-sided SSD, some for single-sided SSD, and I will be covering them at the end of the video. So you can go about that if you choose. But if you want to learn more about this, I do recommend you watch this video all the way through, because there are some areas of SSDs, particularly M.2 SSDs that we're going to be talking about in the next week or two, where it's incredibly important to understand why this is different to this. This is the SSD we are used to. So let's go through it. First and foremost, why do you need a heatsink at all? Why are they so different? Well, for a number of you that have taken advantage of SSDs in the last few years, a number of you, I'm sure, are aware that SSDs are way faster than traditional hard drives. In order for modern consoles like the PS5 to take advantage of this enhanced speed, they've had to move away from hard drives and onto SSDs. Up until the last few years, most people's understanding of SSDs were that. This is known as a 2.5-inch SSD. Now, it seems very different to what we're seeing here in this newer generation of SSD. The reason being that these SSDs, although they are, a little board in there known as a PCB, and there's chips on there known as cells or NAND, and there's a controller which is kind of like the CPU of this, and there's a little bit of memory there to help things move it along. The main difference between these is these SSDs arrive in this outer casing. Now, inside there are tiny little heat sinks, the little panels there, and these help dissipate the heat inside there when it's in operation, as well as the external casing also assisting the heat dissipation when they're being utilized. Now, new generation NVMe's generate a lot of heat. These take advantage of a connection known as M.2 NVMe, which is kind of like PCIe based, kind of like graphics card based connectivity. I'm not going to go into a vast amount of detail there, but the result is that SSDs, unlike hard drives which use cylindrical platters which are then accessed via magnetism, these take advantage of electricity purely on the NAND for basically verifying zeros and ones across the whole SSD. The result is that these SSDs are filled with massive amounts of comparative electricity all the way through, and that's what generates the heat. And when these are in operation, maintaining some of those speeds in excess of 5, 6, 7,000 megabytes per second, the result is that these can get very hot. Now, that heat does 2 main things. When they're very hot, the drive's performance will drop. It just cannot operate as well as it can, its potentially maximum able to, with that much heat. The second thing it does is it can be detrimental to the SSD as the days, weeks, months or years go by. So that is why you need to look at heatsinks. Now, many people would have argued, why didn't Sony just include a heatsink? Why isn't there a dissipation heatsink panel in there? Well, that's for 2 reasons. One, because SSDs are built different. Not all NVMe's are built equally. This one here, for example, gives 3,000 megs. This one here gives 4,000 megs. This one here gives 7,000 megs. They're all very different. They require a different architecture, and some of them are different sizes and heights as well. Sony couldn't just bundle in a default heatsink there that would cover all of the SSDs, and that's why there's not one inside there, although the rest of the system obviously has quite a lot of cooling inside. Now, heatsinks on these SSDs do vary in a number of ways. Now, I mentioned earlier on, let's get the SSD. This is the Sabrent Rocket Plus. Ignore the fact that the labels are lifted. We've just done a hardware review on this SSD. And inside, if I do remove that panel there, and just to show you, let's get that lifted. Inside there, if we lift that panel, you can see all of those chips. All of those chips need to be maintained in temperature when they're in operation. Now, this high-end SSD here, you can get an optional heatsink from Sabrent. This is it. This massive heatsink. This is huge. I don't know if you caught my other video. That doesn't technically fit inside there. Now, we've got one here already pre-disassembled. And inside, you've got the base panel that goes underneath the SSD. And then inside there, you take your SSD, you install it in there. When that heatsink panel has a little peelable bit that sticks the bottom of the SSD down. And then on top of that, you place the heatsink panel. Now and again, normally these would all be adhesive together if you remove those panels. And that is the full thing. The SSD is only this tiny little slither there at the bottom. Now, the way that they work is rather than having moving parts, these heatsinks draw all the heat from that SSD. They suck it all up into there, and then via those metal grooves at the top and in some cases copper-based lines, they dissipate the heat externally and they remove as much of that heat as possible into the surrounding environment, and therefore allows the SSD to maintain a better performance temperature. It's incredibly important, but again, massive SSD here, and I will show you in a little bit what I mean by that being big. But there are alternative heatsinks out there. Now, one of the most common and unfortunately the most cost-effective ways that people utilize cooling on SSDs is a combination of using these, which are thermal pads. And again, these do not dissipate heat. These are a transition substance here. You attach those to your SSD, and then the SSD needs to be attached to a heatsink. A good example of that is on this card from a brand known as Synology. This is a card that has 2 NVMe slots inside, and it has a giant heatsink panel with all the grooves for the air to pass through. If we remove that top panel there, that giant heatsink, you can see some thermal pads in there. And again, the SSD would have to sit on those thermal pads to be connected in there. So a lot of people who go the really, really cost-effective route will purchase an SSD, and then instead of getting an enterprise-grade heatsink, what they'll buy are thermal pads like those, and then they'll buy tiny little heatsinks. These. Bring that closer to camera. Really, really small heatsinks that you just stick onto your SSD. These knock around for about 50 pence, a quid. You buy them in bags, and you attach one of these to every single chip on that SSD, the big ones. Bomb, bomb, bomb. And if it is a double-sided SSD, pop it over there. That is not a great way to work. You can make sure that certain SSDs have the right heat there, but it is better to have an overarching covering of the whole SSD to enable airflow to carry over the whole SSD. Which leads us onto hard do's and don'ts. If you are looking at purchasing a heatsink, you can get some very, very good ones these days for around $10 to $20, but it is worth highlighting that in between all of those, there are some problems, so do follow these steps. First and foremost, you will see a lot of more compact SSD heatsinks utilizing silicon bands. Now, hopefully there's an image on screen. These are SSD heatsinks like the ones we've seen earlier, but they have a surrounding silicon or rubberized band that holds the top of the SSD heatsink to the SSD. They'll have a metal plane, the SSD, the heatsink, and a band that goes around it. Now, these are fine, but it should be mentioned that unless you get one of fairly good quality, a lot of these bands aren't fantastic. Under the heat, they will dry out and fray and snap, and in some cases, they're not actually able to withstand the heat that we are talking about here. We are talking about, oh, I can't touch that, it's going to burn my finger sort of heats. So avoid, in my opinion, any heatsink that uses silicon or rubberized bands, unless you are getting quite a high quality one that can withstand those extra pieces of heat. Next, bear in mind that there is a distinct difference between single-sided NVMe and double. If you're looking at up to 1 terabyte for the SSDs, you may find, and this is an old SSD 970 Pro, this isn't PS5 appropriate by the way, on one side are all of the chips, and the other side is nothing. It's completely blank. That is a one-sided SSD. Now, if you're going for 1 terabyte SSD storage upgrade for your PS5, that means that you can get away with much, much smaller heat sinks because you only have to worry about heat dissipation on the one side. So if you're going for a 1 TB SSD, there's a bit of range of options out there for you, but just bear in mind if you're going for a larger SSD, generally 2 or 4 terabyte, they are going to be double-sided SSDs, and therefore you have to make sure you get a heatsink that is sufficiently thermal supportive of either side of that SSD inside there. Next, when you look at the specifications for any heatsink on, Amazon, any shop really, let's be honest, there's loads of shops out there, I don't know where you live, but when you look at them, they'll give you the dimensions in height, width and depth. Now generally the lengths will be absolutely fine. It will go up to I think 110 millimeters in length and 25 millimeters in breadth. That's fine, you could ignore that because all SSDs, with the exception of the very long ones, are always going to be that length anyway, all the way up to 22110. However, the height of the heatsink, that height there, because this is huge, this is basically 2 centimeters, this is way too big. You have to make sure that you never exceed 11.25 millimeters or 1.125 centimeters. That's your lot. To put that into perspective, here's a tape measure. We are talking all the way up there, and we are talking smaller than that little clip there at the top. Very, very small sizes there. Now, with those heatsinks, when you see the official specs on the hardware specifications, do not be surprised if when you look at it, they'll say, oh my God, it's 10 or 10.5 millimeters. And you're like, yay, that's less than 11.25. A lot of the time, they do not take into account the SSD that's being installed inside. So whenever you look at the size of any SSD, let's get that out of there. If you look at the size of any SSD heatsink before you buy it, and it says it's less than 11.25 millimeters, before you buy it, double check that that size includes the SSD. To put it into perspective, that's an SSD with 1 thermal panel on the top. You're going to have another one underneath, and that is going to increase things by around about 7 millimeters. It's going to increase things quite dramatically. Just having a look there at that heatsink panel. So if they don't include in that dimension the SSD and 2 heatsink panels, maybe avoid it. Another thing, when you do look at a number of these heatsinks from different brands that seem to be really, really affordable, and you see some of them going for $10, $15, $20, and all of a sudden one pops up for $3 or $4, hold your high horses. One of the main reasons for that could be that they do not include the thermal pads. You'll have to purchase them separately. And when you do purchase them, you have to buy them in bulk. On top of that, a lot of the time they use quite poor quality heatsink materials there on the top. So again, it is worth spending a little bit more on the heatsinks, definitely in excess of 10. I would go close to $15 where possible when you are buying a heatsink, because you will get what you pay for. Another thing that is worth bearing in mind, and something I touched on my previous video, but in nowhere near enough detail, that is the slot where your M.2 NVMe SSD is going to live in your PS5. It's generally covered by this here. And when you put SSD heat sinks with the SSD inside these systems, a lot of the time, like me, you might be thinking, right, well, even though that's raised out of the slot there, the body and the chassis of this cover are still going to allow that SSD to fit absolutely fine with airflow flowing all the way through the device. However, one thing we didn't note enough in our previous video is that this SSD is raised too high. The SSD has been raised by around 2 to 3 millimeters there from ground level. And that means that this SSD isn't actually in alignment with the slot. So if you get a heatsink, make sure you bear in mind that the base of it mustn't raise that SSD too high. If we get another class SSD down here, they will slot inside very, very easily. And then you pop it down and then you place the screws that you would normally use inside to keep that SSD in place. But just bear in mind, when you do install SSDs inside a heatsink, that you want to make sure it doesn't raise that up as high as this one does. Maybe try to see if you can get thinner thermal pads or thermal pads and a thinner outer cage mechanism there. But that is one of the main reasons for this idea that the SSDs have to be a certain size in terms of the heatsink. Otherwise, they will not actually go into that slot there at the right depth and height. So after all of that, what are the SSD heatsinks that I would recommend? Well, right now, confirmation is still not 100%. They're still making their way through SSDs that are supported by the system and therefore heatsinks that can wrap around them. And there's a lot more heatsinks than there are SSDs. However, I've narrowed down a few that are compatible with single and double-sided SSDs for the heatsinks that can go round, although their model and IDs is by no means easy to go by. Probably the easiest, I think, that's going to be the most reliable is the EZ Fab, and yes, I'm looking at my notes. This one knocks around for about $15, but it's 9mm in height without the SSD inside. That gives you quite a lot of space to play with when installing a single or double-sided SSD, and also arrives with spare heat panels inside as well. On top of that, if you are looking at single-sided SSDs, there's the, get ready for the name, MHQJRH SSD. Is a bit of a tighter fit, that one, so I would only recommend it for single-sided SSDs. So again, 1 TB only, but that knocks around for about $9.99. And again, it's single-sided only, I would say on that, and it only arrives in the one colour. And then you've got the two kind of slightly snazzy ones, the Ice Cold, INEO. This is one that's 10mm including the SSD, which is great to see. And that one has a really nice customized heat panel heatsink there at the bottom. And then finally, we've got another SSD casing here, which, although I still recommend it only for single-sided 1 TB SSDs, it does still seem to have a little bit of wiggle room there. The Warship Pro, it knocks around for about $8.99, so it's pretty cost-effective. And it even arrives with spare heatsink panels as well, in case you swap out other SSDs or want to review or put other conductive panels between it and the heatsink panel that lives on top of it. But again, bit of a snug fit, that one. I still do think that when I'm utilizing SSDs and I'm waiting for the full release rather than the beta, I don't even have access to the beta, but when I do, I'm still not going to want to use it. Maybe here for the channel on my spare, but I'm not going to use it personally until the full release, because people have already started reporting a few little inconsistencies in game load and a few crashing things. So again, maybe hold out until the full release. But nevertheless, I personally, when I'm going to use my PS5, I'm not going to have this panel here. I'm going to get the heatsink and I'm going to leave that panel uncovered. I want as much airflow to that bay as possible. And given you've got this cooling fan here, and given you've got that additional ventilation space built into the casing, that is what I think I'm going to do, and I hope maybe you give that a try for yourself, because it is about how much air can make its way through those little grooves and gunnels there on each of them, or whether it is the giant PCIe cards where they have a huge amount of heatsink control, or whether you're going to utilize some of those tiny, more cost-effective pads there, which I personally don't recommend. It's all about airflow, getting as much airflow to that slot, and therefore I'm slightly dubious of leaving this to cover that. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. Again, in the description, there is a link over to NAS Compared, where we've listed a bunch of heatsinks, and I will be regularly updating that, because I do think the more we know about this subject, whether it's community forums like Reddit or a bunch of other editorial websites, a lot of this information is being provided in a way that Sony themselves haven't really been forthcoming in giving to people, which is super annoying. If you have enjoyed the video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. And as mentioned, as soon as the PS5 expansion update is more readily available, I have a bank of PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSDs ready to test from Seagate, from Samsung, from WD, from Sir Brent, from Corsair, all of these SSDs, and I'm going to be bench testing every single one here on the channel. So if you hold out for those, you might get a better understanding of what's the best SSD you should buy. So hold out a little longer and wait out for those tests. But thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time.